Don Pritz was the first representative of AA to introduce AA to Russia. And a number of years later, Tom, who was sponsored by Don P., also brought the message to Russia. Okay, was that the first? I think I got most of that stuff. Yeah, I think I covered all the stuff I know about Tom. I love Tom. He's a brother from another mother. And, oh, that's the last thing. I hope he will talk about, because he knows the origins of the set-aside prayer. Maybe he'll teach you guys that. Please bring Tom. Please, warm welcome for Tom.
Recording in progress.
Okay, continue. Hi, everyone. My name's Tom. I'm an alcoholic. I'm a recovered alcoholic. And by the grace of the loving God, I've been continuously sober since June the 15th of 1986. And I'm very, very grateful for that date. And I dropped the ball because I forgot I was supposed to do this. And I think, Ali, I'm supposed to speak for 35 minutes. Is that the idea? Yeah, okay. I can do that. I can speak for 2 hours and 35 minutes, but I'll keep it to 35. So I'll quickly tell you my experience with the Big Book, and then hopefully I'll shoot a few sacred cows along the way. It's always fun. And at any rate, I got sober in '86, and I got sober in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I went back to, and it just was a miracle that I even got sober. I couldn't believe that I had lived through what I put myself through, and a lot of other people couldn't. In fact, there's people that even today in Santa Fe, they'll see me and they say, "I thought you died years ago," because I should have. But at any rate, so against all odds, I survived and went through a treatment center. I never expected to get sober. I went in there to hide out from the storm I'd created of my life. And AA found me there. And that's a whole other story that, this is not the forum for that. But it was a really wonderful story and a lot of God shots through that. But at any rate, I went back to Santa Fe after 33 days in the hospital. And I never heard much at all about the Big Book. I think there were a few around, and maybe, people would use the Big Book to pick a topic for a meeting. That was about it. And so I had various sponsors who did various things. And back then, it's so funny. I just shared about this last night at a meeting that they had me speak here in Nashville. And there was a lot of psychobabble running through the rooms at that point that I got sober. And you'd see more copies of The Road Less Traveled by Scott Peck than you would the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's not a bad book, but it's not AA. So anyway, and we were all looking for our inner child, and it was just an interesting time in AA, or at least in Santa Fe AA. So we're cruising along. I finally got a sponsor who really saved my life, this woman, Mary Thayer, because she knew the Big Book inside and out. And I was 3 years sober when I met her. She was 16 years sober. She'd gotten sober in LA. And she was very clear when she spoke at meetings. And I just, was gravitated towards her. She was in these little meetings north of Santa Fe where I went. We became friends, and ultimately I asked her if she would sponsor me because I'd been without a sponsor for about a year and a half. See, at 2 years sober, I became a treatment center counselor myself, which was odd because I was a high school dropout, but they let me run groups. And when you're in that position at 2.5, 3 years sober, who needs a sponsor? You know everything, So anyway, that was and obviously I didn't know everything, and it was only by grace that I got through that. But I asked Mary Thayer to sponsor me, and she said I had to ask my wife, Juanita, which I did. And she said, "I don't like it, but you need a sponsor really badly, so go ahead." And a year later, Juanita asked Mary Thayer to sponsor her in Al-Anon. So it was a very strange setup. For about 6 years, we had the same sponsor. And I could go on and on about that. But at any rate, Mary Thayer really introduced me to the Big Book. Kind of the spirit of the Big Book, I would say. And it was tremendous. I mean, I was learning new stuff all the time. But internally, because I hadn't treated my alcoholism, between 5 and 6 years, I hit a wall. And I always talk about this, that, there's more than one surrender here. I mean, I had a major, major surrender the fourth night I was in that treatment center, and I saw my life for exactly what it had become and what a complete washout I was. But this other surrender was different, and it was, I had thought that beverage alcohol was really my problem. That if I got the Jack Daniels for breakfast routine out of the way, that I would have a happy and productive life, and it just didn't happen like that. And it took me almost 6 years to learn that alcoholism doesn't live in a bottle of Jack Daniels; it's inside of me. So some of us are more hard-headed than others, I guess. But at any rate, or more egotistical, or I don't know what it is. At any rate, but I was constantly trying to help people in an ineffective way, and I was praying that whole time, and I believe that's what kept me going. So in 1992, in April, I took a newcomer from Santa Fe down to Roswell, New Mexico, to an AA conference. There, I ran into a taper friend of mine, a guy who made tapes from Moore, Oklahoma, and he said, "Here, I think you should listen to these talks." And it was this guy Joe Hawk, who has passed away, and this woman Treva were doing a one-day step workshop in Altadena, California. And so I started listening to it, and it was like nothing I had ever heard. And basically what Joe was saying was that if you'll submit to the process outlined in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, it's guaranteed that you will recover from alcoholism. Now, just that statement alone would have blown half of Santa Fe away, because you never say you're recovered. Oh, no, no. If you say you're recovered, you're setting yourself up for a slip. And I believe this comes to us from the treatment industry. I don't know. But I always say in my talk, the Big Book, 15 times that I've counted, says we will recover. So, and then I, sarcastically say, but I guess the Big Book's wrong, and people who say you'll never recover are right, But at any rate, so, so at any rate, I hear these tapes, and I went, I came home and listened to them all the time. And I was sponsored a guy named Danny C., who's now lives in Bali and Manado, Indonesia. And he and I took these tapes, and we would run them back and forth. That's a nice thing about cassettes, is that you can run them back and forth, and you can pick out stuff and take notes. And so we made what we called a fourth step guide from what Joe had said. And all it was straight from the Big Book, okay? But it was a good exercise for us. And we've used that for many years, and still are using it, but probably 32 years later, something like that. At any rate, so that October of 92, Joe Hawk was going to speak in Amarillo, Texas, and I wanted to meet him. I was totally into these tapes and his message. So I went to Amarillo, and I met Joe, and he said to me, first thing he said to me was, "How do you write inventory?" And I said, "You mean like Hazelden or CompCare?" He goes, "No, man, like from the Big Book, like, 4 columns for resentment, and the columns for the fear inventory, and then the sex conduct inventory." I said, "Dude, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never been exposed to that." And I never had. I mean, I kind of knew what it was from his tapes, but I didn't have any experience with that. So he took a cocktail napkin, and he showed me how to write inventory on a cocktail napkin, in which he used to like to do that. But at any rate, and I'd been listening to his talks, and I'd heard about Don P. and these other people in Denver that were his heroes. And he said, he said, are you going to go to, well, he did a lot of things. He asked me what I was powerless over. And I said, oh, Joe, I'm powerless over everything. I'm a garbage can. And they taught me in the treatment center that I'm powerless over everything. He said, Tom, I don't think a person can be powerless over that many things, but I do think it's really important to understand what you're powerless over. He said, do you know what powerless means? And I said, well, yeah, that it screws up your life. And he said, no, powerless means that you don't have a choice over it, that you don't have the power to choose whether you do it or not. You choose not to, you end up doing it. Okay, it's pretty simple, but that's the essence of it. And he said, can I make a suggestion? I said, yeah. He said, take everything that you ever put in you and put it through the doctor's opinion and change the word alcohol to whatever these substances were. Because I took a plethora of drugs. I mean, anything that I heard about, I got a hold of and did it. And when I went through, I was amazed because I couldn't find cocaine in there, but I found beverage alcohol and heroin, bing, bing, boom, boom, all the way through. And what happened was through that exercise, I know clearly what I'm powerless over, meaning what I don't have a choice over. There was an old timer in Olive Branch, Mississippi, Franklin Williams, and he used to say, you can't come back from someplace you ain't never been. And what that means is you can't recover from something you don't have. Okay. So it's Joe impressed this upon me, and I do it with my guys. It's vitally important to know what's wrong with you if you're going to diagnose yourself and get well from that. So that was one of the things he gave me. Then he said, and Ali, you're going to have to give me some prompts on the time because I'm not keeping it. I'm just wound up in the sound of my own voice. Yeah. So Joe goes, well, are you going to go to Breckenridge this summer? And I said, Kentucky? Because that's the only Breckenridge I knew of. He said, no, man, to Colorado. And I said, what's that? He said, oh, it's the Fellowship of the Spirit Conference. And I said, well, what's that? He said, it's the Cannes Film Festival of people who do the work from the Big Book. And it's up in Breckenridge, Colorado. And I thought, whoa, that's pretty cool. So I dragged Juanita up there. She didn't want to go. And now when we go up this late July, we will have been to 30 of them in a row, one on Zoom. And at any rate, so when I went up there, I'd heard about these big book thumpers and this and that, and that they were kind of mean SOBs and they would beat you with the book and this and that. And I kind of, went up with not exactly fear and trepidation, but I was anxious about it. You know what I mean? When I got up there, Don had handpicked all these people, and they were all big book people. He had Gary B speaking. He had, and Mickey M was up there, and he was on a panel. They had Bob O spoke. The late great Earl Husband from Oklahoma City, who was a fourth step magician. They had him on the fourth step. Clint Hodges, the late great, my dear friend, was on the ninth step. And just these dynamic people. And I experienced more laughter and more tears than I ever had in Alcoholics Anonymous. And what came to me is these big book people who are doing this were actually, not reading the big book, forget that, but they're using it as an instruction manual, and they're doing what it says to do in there. So they're more alive and more engaged in life than anybody I've ever known in AA. And it was exactly the opposite of what I was afraid it would be, So anyway, they were an incredible attraction to me, for this. And I wanted what they had. There was a lot of poo-pooing the ninth step where I lived, like, don't worry about it. That was then, this is now. This too shall pass, that kind of thing. And these guys were brutal about finishing all your amends. I mean, they were, they just were, that was their deal, and doing multiple fourth and fifth steps and doing multiple trips through the steps in general, the working and reworking of the 12 steps. So I got on board with that. Like, I think I had known that there was more to Alcoholics Anonymous than just sitting in these meetings And, you know, a lot of times listening to people complain about their problems with no solution. And there had to be more. And it just seemed like there was. And it turned out there really was, you know. In Santa Fe for years, I was called a big book thumper. And I always correct them. I say, I'm not a thumper, I'm an advocate. And I'm an advocate because once I submitted to that process, you know, Don used to say, made myself available to the material, my whole life changed. You know, it really did. I mean, I didn't know why I was alcoholic. I thought it was all the dramatic stuff I had done. And when I went through, you know, from the doctor's opinion all the way through to, you know, we agnostics, I saw myself. I tell you what amazed me. I'm here in Nashville, and I was born 60 miles up the road in Bowling Green, Kentucky in 1948. And when I read the big book and really, really got it, like what they were saying, I went, holy tamale, man. Like, you know, they knew I was coming. They wrote it in 38. I was born in 48. They knew I was headed this way like 10 years before I got here. I mean, it's like my autobiography. The other thing that the Denver people did, they were real big on, was read it in the first person singular and see how it fits, you know. And that was a great dynamic. I mean, that made it come alive, you know. And it was a trick because if I'm reading about some old cats in the 30s that I could give a rat's ass about, it'll put me to sleep at night. But if I'm reading my own autobiography, it's a whole different kettle of fish, man, because me is the thing I'm most interested in. And so suddenly this is about me. And so they kind of tricked me that way. Anyway, doing the 4-step was incredibly illuminating. There's not time to tell you all of that. Um, Doing a 5th step with Mary Thayer up in Maine, you know, a really major one, it changed my life. That's all I can say, you know. And I've gone through the steps a la the big book, you know, many times since then. Um, here's a couple of things. Joel said the set aside prayer. You know, Don was my sponsor for 8 years until he died, and he was also my hero. And before he was my sponsor, I sat at his feet, you know, and tried to, you know, suck up everything I could, you know, and absorb everything I could from Don. And the story that Joe Hawk told me and Don told me, okay, was that Joe had been it was 10 years trying to get sober. He'd been through 10 treatment centers. He was a rich kid from Battle Creek, Michigan, and just never could get sober. And he's in a treatment center, and Don Fritz speaks there, and he asks for his card, and Don gives him his card. And so Joe was sober longer than he ever had been. He had 6 months in a row sober in Denver. He said he had a little job, a little car, a little girlfriend, you know, a little apartment. And the wheels came off when he was 6 months sober, and he was losing it. And so he called Don, and Don said, Joe, come out to my house, you know, in Aurora, and we'll talk about it, as we do, you know. And so Joe goes out, and Don says, well, tell me about yourself, Joe. Joe had been through so many treatment centers. He'd also done a year in the Michigan State Pen, and he had gone back to school and gotten an MSW so he could be a counselor in treatment centers. And so he's telling Don, oh, I work in the treatment center and I teach THIQ theory and I do this and I do that. And in the midst of it, Don stops him and he says, Joe, whoa, man, put the brakes on. He says, Joe, you know just enough about alcoholism to be dangerous to yourself and everyone you come in contact with. Why don't you say a prayer and ask that God allow you to set aside everything you think you know about your alcoholism for an open mind and a new experience? And that is, as far as I know, was the birth of what we call the set aside prayer. Joe started, you know, kind of pimping that around. And I asked Don about it because I didn't just take Joe's, you know, word for it. And he said, yeah, he goes, you know, God gave me something to tell Joe, and Joe took it and turned it into an institution, you know. But I know that he understood, as wise as Pritz was, he understood that must have been needed or that wouldn't have happened. And I tell you, they were saying it in Australia. We did the ONC 3 years ago, 1809. They were saying it in Canada, so they're saying it all over the world, apparently, you know. And so it was something that rose up that was needed, but that's the birth of it. Another thing that happened, I wanted to meet Don, and I met him in '93, the month before the first Fellowship of the Spirit. He spoke in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so Juanita and I went to hear him, and we got there early, and we talked to him for quite a while. He had gotten there early, and so we talked to him for about a half an hour. He had a $2 bill story, which if you've never heard it, I'm not going to tell it, but go listen to us. And so we gave him a couple $2 bills because that was part of that deal, and then started talking to him. And I said, man, I am going to Fellowship the Spirit. I'm on fire for this big book stuff. I said, I've been, communicating with Joe a lot, and I've even got the workbook. Okay, because what it was Joe sent me like a mimeograph copy of what would become the Big Book Awakening book. And Don just looked down and he shook his head and he goes, Joe and Mark have made a book that's longer than the big book to tell you how to work the steps from the big book. Tom, all you need is the big book. Okay. Now, that's one of the sacred cows I wanted to shoot, because you'll hear people say, oh, Don Pritz did this. No, from the horse's mouth, he never did. He never put that book together. So at any rate, are we having fun yet? So, okay. All right. So, I have had so many experiences with the book, and there's something that resonates with me. Mark Houston, who was a friend of mine, he used to say, don't let anybody read your big book for you. And, people will misquote it all constantly, constantly. It used to drive me crazy, and it just doesn't anymore. I was sitting in a meeting in Santa Fe, and I was speaking, and I asked me to pick a topic. My topic was whether you finish your 9-step amends or not. Does that have anything to do with whether you stay sober or not? And an old timer guy, who's a guy who has actually now he's in poor health, but he has more than 50 years now, chose to share, and he said, you need to watch some of these sponsors, because they'll have you making amends and you'll end up in jail. And he goes, our book says we don't go to jail. And I just thought I wasn't, the encyclopedic guy that I am today, but I knew, and I'd read it enough to know, wait a minute, it says we have to be willing to face jail, right? But I didn't want to, it seemed like the etiquette was that I didn't want to contradict this guy. Plus, he had helped start CA in California and, was kind of a heavy hitter. And I was intimidated. I mean, I just, and I didn't say anything. And I've regretted that to this day. I was just in a meeting here in Nashville at a low bottom treatment center Tuesday night. And I talked about that I was a recovered alcoholic. One of the other guys speaking, who had 30 years, I have 35, he had 30. He said, well, our big book doesn't say, it never says anywhere that you'll recover from alcoholism. And I sat there thinking, I don't know what book he's reading, but anyway. But I gave up many years ago being the AA police, Don used to say this thing. He said, if they're on fire and we're taking them through the big book, through the steps as outlined in the big book, and they don't hit the evangelical stage, we've missed something, okay? He said, but if they stay at the evangelical stage, we have definitely missed something, okay? So thank God, literally, I have evolved out of that. I don't have to police anyone. I don't have to correct people. All I have to do is have integrity with this thing and do what I think is right. A couple of other things that I was thinking about right before this. I know Mildred's going to speak, and I love Mildred, and wished I was here for it, but I've got to listen to a fifth step, and I can't be here. I already had made this plan, but I met Mildred probably 25 years ago in Taos, New Mexico. She was speaking. And I said, Mildred, did you happen to know a man named Mac Cheater from Winnipeg, Canada? And she said, oh my God, I can't believe I didn't talk about him. She goes, if you knew Mac, you knew an angel walking. That's literally what she said to me. And Mac Cheater was super important in my lineage because he and the Golden Slipper people in 1975 came down to Denver and and brought the message that you can take a group of people through the big book as a group. And that's what he'd been doing with the Golden Slippers in Winnipeg. And those guys, kind of proselytized the Denver young people. And that was Don and Mickey and Mary Jo and all these, people that were in the Denver young people. And they took that message and spread it out really across the world, that you can have big book step workshops where you have a collective experience. It's not the same as a one-on-one, but it's a super good experience. And we've been doing those for years now. Don used to do a 33-week deal in Denver, and sometimes he would have a big book Al-Anon, co-facilitate with him. So that's also a part of our deal. Something that just happened recently. One of our dear friends in Al-Anon is Merp. It's Mary Pearl T is who she is. She lives in Little Rock, and Big Book Al-Anon from she'll be, I think, 40 years coming up. I think it is 40 years, or maybe more than that. But at any rate, she and Juanita have been good friends because Juanita nearly drowned me in the bathtub when I was passed out there. And Merp did drown her husband in the bathtub when he was passed out. So they had that in common. It kind of was a bonding thing for them. And so, Joel, but we've loved her. I mean, she stayed at our house in Santa Fe, and she and I have a lot in common that I won't go into. But at any rate, she was sponsored her entire time by one woman. And that was Joe McQuaney's wife, Lou Bell McQuaney. Okay, Lou Bell just passed away like 3 months ago. She was in her 90s, and so Mary Pearl was around Joe McQuaney a whole lot. And years ago, probably 15 or so, we drive past her house because we drive from Santa Fe to Nashville on I-40, and goes right through Little Rock. And so we stopped and we went to her home group meeting on a Monday night. And I said, Merp, I've always wanted to meet Joe McQuaney, Joe M. And she goes, well, he's doing a step thing right now. I'll have one of my sponsees take you up there. And so I went up to this recovery place, and Joe every Monday would do a step series. And I walked in, and there were 250 black people and one white guy, me. And it was phenomenal. It was on the 6th and 7th step, and Joe still had it. He had diabetes by then, but man, he rocked it. And at the end, we had a thank you line, and I got to hug Joe McQuaney and thank him for his contribution to Alcoholics Anonymous. And I think, as much as anyone, Joe McQuaney and Charlie Parmley, brought the message of Big Book Step Work to the fellowship. And that was in the late 70s, So Mary Pearl's, when we just visited her, I guess I didn't tell you that. We stopped and saw her, and she hadn't had anybody in her house because she was scared of COVID. But she let us in, and Juanita brought her some flowers, and we spent an hour with her. And she just casually was telling us the story. She said, I was over at Lou Bell's, so I was in her living room, and Joe was there, and Charlie Parmley came over, and they're talking, and they said, wouldn't it be cool if we kind of did a big book thing together, and we kind of took it on the road and like did workshops for people? And I said, Merp, you were there when that idea was born? She goes, yeah, so what? I said, so what? You don't know how historic that is in our fellowship, what that means to us, Anyway, so just, some reminiscences. I could, talk about step work in the big book. I did. I was in Maryland last weekend. They gave me 2 hours on the 4th step. And I think I bored them senseless. But, I could talk about the mechanics and all that. But what was so important to me was two things. One is that I finally was doing AA someone else's way, not the as Tom sees it that I'd been doing in the beginning. I had submitted to something else and really surrendered to something else and took direction from what I consider to be the baseline of Alcoholics Anonymous. And that was really important, that dynamic for me. And the other thing is, I believe the big book is divinely inspired. for many reasons. One is they didn't even know what they were writing when they wrote it. Most of those guys had never worked the steps as outlined in the big book. I mean, I've heard a lot of stuff. I've studied the history, and I've talked to a lot of old timers and people who knew the Oxford groupers and all that. Shit, they didn't even know what they were doing, man. They just were conduits for this stuff, which has worlds upon worlds within it. I'm 35 years sober. I just 2 days ago turned 74 years old, and I am finding stuff in the big book, not stuff I did years ago, but new stuff, like expansion and just ideas that, and probably it's because my experience has changed, and so the stuff in there hits me at a different level. But it's just remarkable. It really is. Do we have any time left at all, Allie? Yeah, how much? 10 minutes? Really? Good Lord. Well, one of the things I've been doing lately, and one of the things that hit me, the book in the third step, there's a throwaway line, or some people consider it a throwaway line. It says, we had to quit playing God because it didn't work. And we had to quit playing God, not because it's naughty or it's not a good idea. 5 minutes, okay, but because it doesn't work. It's not practical. We have a hero of ours is Tom I in North Carolina, and he said this years ago. He said the key word in Alcoholics Anonymous is effectiveness. Like, is it working? And that's the way we do the sex inventory. We don't care, if it's moral or this or that. What we want to know is it working for you, or is it killing you? You know what you're doing. I mean, it's not good or bad. Is it effective? And so, that's a really big deal throughout the book. But I had to quit playing God because that doesn't work. And over the years, that idea has meant more and more and more to me as I delve into it, and I see the ways that I try to play God, the more subtle and subtle ways. I mean, there's the gross ways where I think I know better than you, and I start telling you what to do, and think I know how the world ought to operate and stuff. But then there's the ways that I try to protect myself. I put these defenses up, and I become my own God, because I'm not allowing life to be life. I'm not allowing God's creation to unfold. Instead, I'm going to protect myself. I'm going to project negativity. I'm going to do all these things that I do. There's not enough time. I do a whole weekend long workshop on this, so I can't, the 3 minutes I have left, I can't go into it that far. But the last workshop that I did in New Orleans, we had to quit playing God because it didn't work. And then the line, the spiritual life is not a theory, we have to live it. And that's what's been hitting me lately. Like, do I try to live this 24/7? Like, do I try to do that thing of thy will be done, thy will be done, thy will be done? Bring this spiritual idea into everything that I do. And remember that there's an unseen world, as the Lakota say. And remember that, okay? That what I'm looking at is not the entire picture, okay? And I get every bit of that from the big book. Mary Thayer years ago had us looking at the God of reason, and it was capital G, capital R, in we agnostics. And then the great reality that we find deep down within us, capital G, capital R. And the whole idea that we're going to go from the God of reason, which is worshiping this, to the great reality, which is worshiping this, okay? Or, being in touch with this and trying to be directed by this. There's worlds upon worlds in that book, and I do love it. I absolutely do. It's one of the things in recent years that I've tried to do is go to AA meetings and not let my critic tell me, that person's never worked the steps from the big book, or what, that's a bunch of bullshit that they're talking, this and that. But instead, listen to them with compassion and listen to them with my heart, knowing that, they have their experience and they're doing the very best that they can do. And that's another game changer. And I think that's the spirit of the book, Anyway, love you guys. Thanks for listening to me. I hope I said something that made some sense to you.